Hi, good morning. It's once again the nerd in the car. Today I'll be talking about team and how that affects startups. Now, having a good team is usually the first advice which most startup mentors will give startups, and it is a very, very important advice. This particular topic, I really do not have much contradiction actually. I'm not going to say that the usual advice given by mentors is so and so, but I have a difference of opinion and things like that. Team is very important, and I believe that in a startup there should be at the very least two people, two co-founders. And why I say this is a very simple practical reason. If one of the founders fall ill, who will shoulder the responsibility of that particular startup? So it's very important that there should be at least one more person. Now, on a side note, the reason why my particular company, my particular startup is not yet known is because I keep telling and half joking to people that I have three people working for me, I, me, and myself. But jokes aside, I am not particularly happy or convinced that this particular startup which I have is good enough for say an angel investor to come in and invest, because like I would be contradicting what I just said. What if I fall ill, and what happens then to this startup? So I have not really sought out very earnestly angel investors. I have a few friends, and of course my family, my brother, my sister especially, and my parents who have helped me, and my ex-students have helped me. And that's how Lyman Leap Labs, my startup, is currently working. But that's about me, and that's an exception, and I'm not trying to claim that this particular startup is actually viable from an investor's point of view. Having said this, I must kind of develop further on this particular topic, because I am opening up nuances of various type of startup advice. So the thing is that 99% of the time I doubt whether a startup would start with two people magically coming together and spontaneously starting. Maybe when people say these stories, I kind of feel a little skeptical about it. It would be usually that one person was very passionate and really involved in a particular problem, and maybe he was lucky enough to quickly get in the second person, but there will always be an order. In some cases, the time required to get the second co-founder can take time. So the question is, what does one do? Like, if one were to discover a really deep problem with some domain you are involved in, and then it turns out that you have a very cogent way to make that problem go away, and you have your thoughts in mind, you have your skill set, you have your knowledge, you have all that takes to really sit and do something with that particular problem. What do you do? Like, do you say that you know what, I need one more co-founder, because that's the general advice, and if I don't have that, let me stop working on it? Well, I think it's your call. I feel there would be problems which are really grave problems which do deserve a lot of attention, and if you happen to be tackling one of those, I don't think this particular point needs to be taken to heart to such an extent that you say, no, I'm not going to start a company, because where are the people? Probably in another section I'll be talking about the point about capital. How do you how do you get enough capital to start your company? And that is also one of the very badly misunderstood term, that how much money do you really need to start a company? I'll explain that separately. But in this particular point about teams, if you are wanting to solve a really useful problem, okay, a problem which is really hard pressed, and you will need to then ask yourself that you have to do reality uh, checks for sure. uh, Being alone, and if you discover something and you say, you know what, I don't think people are looking into this particular aspect of this problem, and I happen to look into this and I find it really really serious, and there's something which I can do about this, uh, something I can really improve here. I don't think you should get dissuaded that you never really ever able to convince somebody else. Now there are certain riders, of course. If you are discovering a very grave problem which is affecting ordinary consumers, like people just walking on the street, and then you think that you discovered something which affects the world at large, but nobody else did. Well, I would really take that with a pinch of salt, because when you talk about some problem which affects a lot of people at that consumer level, at the level of an individual, who it doesn't matter which category or which domain they fall into, and then you say that I have discovered some really pressing problem which nobody else has solved, I'm not getting a co-founder, but I will go ahead with this because the nerd in the car said that you need to work on serious problems, and here is a serious problem and I'll work on it. Well, the first clue is that if you think that you have a solution for a problem which according to you affects a lot of people, and still you didn't get a co-founder, I think you should I'm sorry to say, you should do some serious reality checks on your assessment. So I would not really go in that direction. I would become a single founder company for those problems where I have domain experience, and really serious domain experience. Say I'm a psychiatrist, and I am seen cases after cases after cases, and then it struck me that there is this hairy problem in psychiatry which needs serious attention, but I'm not able to convince somebody else to join me in my effort. Then it is probably worth your while to still continue on that journey, because you have domain knowledge about that particular vertical, that is psychiatry, and you have spent years completely immersed in that problem. In such a case, having a single person company is quite okay. It's not bad. I mean, you say that, okay, maybe I'm not in a position to really attract co-founders and investors and all that, but that's okay. Like, in fact, the time which you have with yourself to really sit and work out the nuances of the problem which you have understood, and the way you went about checking your confirmation biases and other cognitive biases, and like if in case of that psychiatry example, did that psychiatrist write some papers with in some peer-reviewed journals or conferences, put his case about this particular problem which he has discovered? If he has not done all that, and he just created a particular startup just because he thought that he was a great guy who discovered this new thing in psychiatry, then it's a problem. Then that may not be viable. So what I'm saying is that if you happen to have a deeply immersed knowledge in this particular area, and you are the only one who's doing it, go ahead. I don't think that should be a problem, because eventually people will see the commitment you have to whatever you're talking about, and that commitment would really be seen, because you're not going to be a fly-by-night operator. I mean, you need to prove yourself that you're not a fly-by-night operator. You need to not only be immersed in your domain, but now with your startup, you have to be completely immersed in your startup. And you need to really completely burn your bridges and say that, you know what, I'm so sure that this problem exists, and here are my credentials, here are the papers which I published, this is what I did to talk about it. That, according to me, is highly valuable. and you really can be a big force. At the same time, I agree that investors probably won't come, and I don't think they should really come also, because you need to beef up your organization, your team. Like I told you, you need to have at least one more person. But what happens is that you can set up that particular startup in such a way that when people do join, you can be ready, you would be ready with all the required systems in place. So you become a systems driven person, and if you become a systems driven person, you would really have a very good chance of doing something really nice. So that's my kind of my take on the word team. So team, of course, is a very important thing, but if you happen to be that one person who discovered some critical problem in some specific domain, and then you went at it, and then you got totally engrossed in it, you did all your reality checks, you removed all the fallacies, removed all the cognitive biases, you are actually a really good startup. Probably you are way better than many other startups who just have PowerPoint presentation and some superficial gloss about what they think is the problem, and they may have a team also, but that's not really a way to go about setting up a company. This kind of company which emerges from single person startups are actually pretty viable, and there are enough stories about that. You read about the story of Evernote, for example, and this person was so committed to whatever he was doing, and he really went right out at the end of that proverbial limb to do whatever he was trying to do. In his case, I would say that's quite an exception, because I just kind of discounted people who talk about consumer products in information technology, and Evernote actually is a consumer product, and it does have a very wide market. I myself use Evernote a lot, and it doesn't matter in which domain. So actually that's quite an exception. I've not seen many such Evernote type of example, but still it's a good example. This guy was so committed to getting this thing right. He went on it, and finally I think the story goes that he had his last $800 or something like that in his bank. He said, okay, I'll now shut it down. I don't think I can really run this. Maybe he was, going through his confirmation biases, and he's saying maybe I am having what is known as a sunk cost fallacy, where you keep putting money into something, and because you put money into something again and again, you thought that whatever you're doing is right. That's known as a sunk cost fallacy. And what happens, somebody from some Scandinavian country, if I'm not mistaken, writes to him and says that I think you probably would need some money to get this thing going. I really liked what you're doing. And he got his first check of some crazy amount, $250,000 or something like that. And that's how Evernote became Evernote. So that, I think, was an exception, but there are enough stories of people who were reasonably committed to what they are talking about, and they did some really good work in that particular domain. I'm hoping that by listening to this, there will be people who will say, okay, this guy really worked on this particular software. So my design software, TAD, is now listed amongst the top 5 and top 10, and there's just one person, which is me, who's been working on it. Pardon for telling like this, it's not polite to talk about me all the time, but that's the way it is. I've been completely immersed in this topic of how do we do much better architecture. So there you have it. That's a nerd in the car. I hope to see you in my next videos. Thank you so much.